My brother texted me that his children were in a taxi heading to my house while he boarded a flight to Cabo. He told me to deal with it and turned off his phone. What he did not know was that I had moved 6 months ago to escape his constant financial demands. And the woman who currently lived at my old address was a ruthless district attorney about to teach him a lesson that would shatter his entitled world forever. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your peace. I am Kendra, a 33-year-old forensic corporate accountant. I spend my days tracking missing millions, untangling corporate fraud, and dismantling financial lies for some of the biggest firms in Atlanta. I deal in hard facts, undeniable proof, and strict boundaries. That Saturday morning started exactly the way I like my life to be: quiet, controlled, and completely drama-free. I was standing in the kitchen of my newly purchased ultra-modern penthouse in downtown Atlanta. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning view of the city skyline, a daily reminder of everything I had built with my own two hands and relentless late nights. I was pouring my first cup of dark roast coffee, savoring the silence. For years, my weekends had been hijacked by family emergencies, which was just code for my older brother Jamal needing someone to clean up his messes. Jamal is 35, the undisputed golden child of our family, and a man who has never faced a single consequence in his life. I had finally bought this penthouse and deliberately chosen not to give my family the address. I needed a sanctuary away from their chaos. My phone buzzed on the marble island. I glanced at the screen expecting an early email from a corporate client. Instead, it was a text from Jamal. The message popped up short, arrogant, and entirely typical of him. "Kids are in a cab to your place. Chloe and I are boarding for Cabo. Deal with it." My stomach dropped. I stared at the screen, the words blurring for a second as my mind struggled to process the sheer audacity of the message. Attached was a screenshot of a rideshare receipt. I immediately hit call on his contact. It rang exactly 0 times before going straight to voicemail. He had sent the text and instantly turned his phone on airplane mode to avoid my reaction. A cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck. Jamal had actually put my 6-year-old nephew and 4-year-old niece into a strange vehicle by themselves. But the true horror hit me like a physical blow when I zoomed in on the screenshot of the receipt. The destination address printed in black and white was not my downtown high-rise. It was the address of a modest duplex in South Atlanta, a place I had moved out of 6 months ago. I had spent the last 3 years secretly auditing my family's financial ties to me, quietly untangling myself from the web of loans, co-signed leases, and sudden demands for cash that my parents Yvonne and Desmond always insisted I provide for Jamal. They treated his life like a VIP lounge and mine like the janitorial staff. When Jamal wanted to launch another failed startup, I was expected to fund it. When his white wife Chloe decided she needed a new designer wardrobe to cope with the stress of being a stay-at-home mom who employed a full-time nanny, I was told to be a team player and help out. The last time I spoke to Jamal was in January, standing in the driveway of that very duplex. He had shown up unannounced, demanding I transfer $800 to cover the lease on his luxury SUV. When I refused, pointing out that Chloe had just posted photos of a new handbag that cost triple that amount, he threw a violent tantrum in my yard. Our mother Yvonne called me an hour later, accusing me of destroying my brother's marriage by withholding my excess wealth. That was the day I decided I was absolutely done. I closed the bank of Kendra, expedited my search for a new home, packed up, and vanished from their financial radar. Jamal had not spoken to me since that day. He never even bothered to ask where I lived now, simply assuming I would always be exactly where he left me. Panic gripped my chest tight and unforgiving. 2 toddlers were currently in a stranger's car heading to a house occupied by someone I did not know. I memorized the license plate from his screenshot and dialed the rideshare company's emergency safety line. The automated menu felt agonizingly slow. I paced the length of my kitchen, my mind racing through terrifying worst-case scenarios. When a representative finally answered, I stripped all emotion from my voice, using the precise, clipped tone I reserved for hostile corporate audits. "I have a critical safety issue," I stated, reading off the license plate and the account name. "The account holder placed two unaccompanied minors, ages 4 and 6, into this vehicle. I need you to contact the driver immediately." The operator put me on a brief hold. The silence amplified the hammering of my heart. I stared out at the Atlanta skyline, feeling a wave of nausea wash over me. When the operator returned, her voice was tight with professional concern. "Ma'am, the driver completed that trip 12 minutes ago. He noted in the system that the children were dropped off at the specified residential address." I gripped the edge of the counter. "Did he verify an adult received them?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly. "The driver's notes indicate he watched them walk up to the front porch before driving away," she replied. "They were abandoned on a stranger's porch." I ended the call and threw on the first pair of jeans and sneakers I could find, grabbing my keys and flying out the door. The elevator ride down to the parking garage felt like an eternity. As I sprinted to my car, the echo of my sneakers slapping against the concrete sounded like a ticking clock. I dialed my former landlord, Mr. Henderson. He answered groggily, clearly annoyed by the weekend intrusion. "Mr. Henderson, it is Kendra," I said, throwing my car into reverse. "I need to know exactly who currently leases my old unit," he stammered, complaining about the early hour. "Mr. Henderson," I snapped, peeling out of the parking structure and merging violently onto the street. "My brother just abandoned two toddlers at that address, thinking I still live there. Who is in that house?" The annoyance in his voice vanished, replaced by sheer panic. "Kendra, you need to get over there right now. I rented that unit to Rosalind Carter. She is a senior prosecutor for the district attorney's office. She just moved in last month and she does not tolerate any foolishness on her property." I merged onto the highway, breaking every speed limit as I navigated the morning Atlanta traffic. My grip on the steering wheel was so tight my knuckles ached. Jamal had spent his entire life having his messes cleaned up by our parents. He assumed the world was his personal safety net, that he could just toss his responsibilities onto my porch and fly off to Mexico without a single thought about the consequences. But today, he had messed with the wrong person's porch. The drive from downtown to South Atlanta usually took 25 minutes. I was determined to make it in 15. Every red light felt like a personal attack. I kept imagining my little nephew and niece confused and crying, standing on a concrete porch in the crisp morning air, knocking on a door expecting to see their aunt, only to face a stranger. I pulled out my phone and tried calling Chloe. It went straight to voicemail. They were completely unreachable, likely sipping pre-flight mimosas in the airport lounge, entirely unbothered by the fact that they had treated their children like unwanted luggage. This was classic Chloe behavior. She was a master of weaponized incompetence, always fluttering her eyelashes, and claiming she was simply too overwhelmed by motherhood, leaving Jamal to demand that our family step in to rescue her. And my parents, desperate to keep their golden boy happy, always obliged, forcing me to carry the weight. As I exited the highway and turned onto the familiar streets of my old neighborhood, my mind switched back into forensic mode. I needed to assess the situation, secure the children, and figure out how to shield them from the inevitable fallout of their parents' staggering negligence. I mentally rehearsed what I would say to this district attorney. I planned to apologize, profusely collect my niece and nephew, and deal with my brother myself the second his plane touched down. But as I turned onto my old block, the sinking feeling in my stomach turned into absolute dread. Flashing red and blue lights illuminated the street, casting harsh, rotating shadows against the modest brick duplexes. Two squad cars were parked haphazardly in the driveway, their radios crackling in the quiet morning air. Behind them was a white van bearing the official seal of Fulton County Child Protective Services. My breath caught in my throat. I slammed the brakes, throwing the car into park half on the curb, and threw open the door. Jamal's arrogant assumption that I would just clean up his mess had just collided with the reality of the legal system, and the consequences were already unfolding right before my eyes. I did not even bother grabbing a jacket. I snatched my keys and wallet off the marble island and bolted out the heavy oak door of my penthouse. The hallway was dead silent, a stark contrast to the alarm bells ringing inside my head. The elevator ride, down to the parking garage, felt agonizingly slow. I watched the digital floor numbers tick down at a snail's pace, while my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. 6 years old and 4 years old. That was the only thought cycling through my brain. Two babies standing on a concrete porch in the crisp morning air, clutching their little backpacks, waiting for an aunt who lived 20 minutes away. I hit the garage floor, running, the sharp sound of my sneakers slapping the pavement echoing loudly in the cavernous, dimly lit space. I slid into the leather seat of my car, slammed my foot on the brake, and hit the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I threw it into gear, peeling out of the parking structure and merging violently into the early downtown Atlanta traffic. I had to get to South Atlanta, and I had to get there before anyone with bad intentions realized two children were standing completely unsupervised. The drive from my secure gated high-rise to the working-class neighborhood of South Atlanta was a stark transition. The gleaming glass facades of downtown quickly gave way to older, weathered brick buildings and narrow streets. I navigated the tight corners with a sense of rising dread. South Atlanta was gentrifying, but it still had pockets where you did not want two young children wandering around alone. My nephew, barely tall enough to reach a doorbell, and my niece, still prone to wandering off if she saw a stray cat, were incredibly vulnerable. The thought of someone else finding them before I did made my stomach churn with a sickening fear. I snatched my phone from the passenger seat, keeping one eye on the road. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned ash white. I activated the Bluetooth system on my dashboard and voice-dialed my former landlord, Mr. Henderson. The phone rang 3 times before he answered, his voice thick with sleep and heavy with annoyance. He muttered a gruff greeting, clearly unhappy about a Saturday morning interruption. I stripped all pleasantries from my voice, channeling the exact same icy, authoritative tone I used when catching corporate executives hiding millions in offshore accounts. I told him it was Kendra, and that I needed to know exactly who currently leased my old unit. He stammered, complaining about privacy policies, tenant rights, and the early hour. I cut him off mid-sentence, my voice sharp enough to slice glass. I told him my brother just abandoned 2 toddlers at that address, thinking I still lived there, and I needed to know whose porch they were currently sitting on before I called the police myself. The annoyance in Mr. Henderson's voice vanished instantly, replaced by a sharp intake of breath. The line went quiet for a second before he spoke, his tone completely shifting to sheer panic. He told me I needed to get over there right now. He explained that he had rented that unit to a woman named Rosalind Carter. He swallowed hard before adding the detail that made my blood run cold. She was a senior prosecutor for the Fulton County District Attorney's Office. He told me she had just moved in last month and was a woman who absolutely did not tolerate any foolishness, disruption, or unannounced visitors on her property. The call disconnected and a fresh wave of adrenaline hit my system, making my hands shake. A prosecutor. My brother had sent 2 unsupervised minors to the home of a woman whose entire career was built on putting people in jail for breaking the law. I slammed my foot on the gas, weaving around a slow-moving delivery truck and ignoring the angry blare of a horn behind me. I gripped the steering wheel, my mind flashing back to the last time I had seen Jamal. It was a freezing January afternoon, right in the driveway of the duplex I was currently speeding toward. He had shown up unannounced, banging on my door and demanding I transfer $800 to cover the lease on his luxury SUV. When I refused, pointing out that his wife Chloe had just posted photos on Instagram showing off a new designer handbag that cost triple that amount, he threw a violent tantrum right in my yard. He called me selfish. He called me bitter. Our mother Yvonne called me an hour later, accusing me of trying to destroy my brother's marriage by withholding my excess wealth. She actually told me I needed to be a team player. That was the day the final string snapped. That was the day I decided I was absolutely permanently done. I closed the bank of Kendra, expedited my search for a new home, packed up my life, and vanished from their financial radar. Jamal had not spoken to me since that day. He never even bothered to ask where I lived now, simply assuming I would always be sitting in that duplex waiting for his next command. For 33 years, Jamal had floated through life on a cloud of unearned privilege. Our parents, Yvonne and Desmond, had constructed a reality where Jamal was a king and the rest of the world existed simply to serve his needs. Whenever he failed a class, crashed a car, or quit a job because it required actual effort, they rushed in with their checkbooks and their endless supply of apologies. They created a man who genuinely believed that dropping his children off at a random address via a rideshare app was an acceptable childcare strategy. I thought he could shoot me a text, flip his phone to airplane mode, and fly off to Cabo with his wife Chloe, confident that I would drop everything and clean up his mess. Chloe was just as bad, if not worse. She was a master of weaponized incompetence, always fluttering her eyelashes and crying about how overwhelmed she was by motherhood, leaving Jamal to demand that our family step in to rescue her. And my parents, desperate to keep their golden boy and his fragile wife happy, always obliged, forcing me to carry the weight. They assumed the universe would just magically bend to their will like it always did. But the universe had not bent today. Today, their breathtaking entitlement had collided headfirst with the American legal system. Rosalind Carter was not our mother. She was not going to smile, make excuses, and coddle them. I merged onto the final stretch of road, my tires screeching slightly as I took the turn too fast. As a black woman who worked closely with corporate law, I knew exactly how swift and unforgiving the system could be. The authorities did not play games when it came to child abandonment. They did not care about Chloe's supposed stress or Jamal's demanding entrepreneurial dreams. They only saw facts. And the fact was, 2 children were left alone. I prayed I could get there before any neighbor looked out their window and dialed emergency services. I prayed I could just scoop them up, strap them into my back seat, and drive away before the situation escalated beyond my control. I mentally rehearsed what I would say to this district attorney when I arrived. I planned to run up to the door, apologize profusely for the intrusion present, my identification, collect my niece and nephew, and then deal with my brother the exact second his plane touched down in Mexico. I turned the final corner onto my old block, my eyes scanning the street for the familiar red brick exterior of the duplex. But my foot hit the brake instinctively. The breath caught in my throat, choking off the air in my lungs. I did not even make it to the driveway before the heavy, suffocating reality of the situation crashed over me. Flashing red and blue lights sliced through the morning shadows, casting harsh, rotating beams against the front of the houses. The glare reflected off the wet pavement from the previous night's rain. 2 Atlanta Police Department squad cars were parked haphazardly in front of my old yard, blocking the sidewalk entirely. Their radios crackled sharply in the quiet residential street, cutting through the silence of the morning. Neighbors were already stepping out onto their porches, pulling their robes tight, watching the spectacle unfold. Parked directly behind the squad cars, stark and undeniable in the morning light, was a white van bearing the official seal of Fulton County Child Protective Services. My chest tightened so hard I could barely breathe. The air in the car suddenly felt too thin. I threw my car into park half on the curb, ignoring the jarring scrape of my tires against the concrete, and shoved the door open. The cold morning air hit my face, but I could not feel it. Jamal's arrogant assumption that I would fix everything had just triggered a nightmare he never saw coming, and the system had already arrived to collect its due. I slammed the car door shut, the metallic thud lost under the harsh crackle of the police radios. The damp grass soaked through my sneakers as I sprinted across the front lawn of the duplex I used to call home. An Atlanta police officer immediately stepped into my path, his hand resting instinctively near his duty belt. I did not slow down. I reached into my pocket and thrust my corporate identification badge and my driver license straight toward his chest. I told him my name was Kendra, and that the 2 children inside that house were my nephew and niece. I peered past his shoulder toward the open front door. Standing on the porch, wrapped tightly in an emerald green silk robe, was Rosalind Carter. Even in her sleepwear on a Saturday morning, the woman radiated an intimidating, unyielding authority. She was a formidable presence in the Fulton County legal system, a black woman who had built her reputation on taking down corrupt officials and dismantling criminal networks. Right now, her arms were crossed tight against her chest, and her gaze was fixed on me with laser precision. Just past her, in the small entryway of the duplex, I saw them. 6-year-old Trey had his arm wrapped protectively around his 4-year-old sister Maya. They were sitting rigidly on the edge of a floral sofa that did not belong to me, clutching their little cartoon backpacks. Maya was crying softly, her tiny shoulders shaking, while a woman in a navy blue polo shirt with a CPS lanyard kneeled in front of them, speaking in hushed, soothing tones. My heart physically ached at the sight of them. I tried to step around the officer, my voice rising with desperate urgency. I explained that this was a massive, horrific mistake. I told them my brother had put the wrong address in the rideshare app, that he thought I still lived here, and that I was here to take them home with me right now. Rosalind stepped forward, blocking the doorway completely. Her voice cut through the crisp morning air like a perfectly sharpened blade. She did not yell, but the sheer force of her tone rooted my feet to the concrete steps. She told me to stop right there. Her dark eyes scanned my face, processing my panicked state, but her expression remained completely detached and deeply analytical. She stated the facts with brutal clarity. An adult placed two toddlers in a commercial vehicle completely unsupervised, paid a stranger to drive them across the city, and abandoned them on her private property. She looked me dead in the eye and told me that act constituted criminal child endangerment. She made it absolutely clear that those children were not going anywhere with me or anyone else without a direct court order. Every protective maternal instinct in my body screamed at me to push past her, to snatch Trey and Maya, to shield them from the terrifying reality of social workers and police cars. But the forensic accountant in me, the woman who spent her life dismantling complex corporate fraud and building airtight logical cases, knew better. Rosalind was not the enemy here. She was a prosecutor following the law to the absolute letter. This was the catastrophic collision I had always known was coming. For 33 years, Yvonne and Desmond had shielded my brother Jamal from every single consequence of his actions. They had cultivated a grown man who genuinely believed he was untouchable. Jamal operated under the delusion that he could dump his living, breathing children onto a porch, like discarded Amazon packages, fly off to a luxury resort in Cabo with his white wife Chloe, and expect me to magically clean up the fallout. He thought his golden child status gave him immunity from reality. Now his staggering entitlement had placed his children in the jaws of the legal system, and there was no checkbook big enough to bail him out of this one. I did not argue with Rosalind. Arguing with a district attorney on her own property while a CPS worker documented the scene in the living room was a guaranteed way to end up in handcuffs myself. Instead, I took a slow, deliberate breath, forcing my racing heart to steady. I needed her to understand that I was not a negligent accomplice, but rather the collateral damage of a wildly toxic family dynamic. I unlocked my phone, opened my text messages, and pulled up the thread with Jamal. I held the phone out, offering it directly to Rosalind. I kept my voice incredibly calm, telling her that I respected her position and had no intention of obstructing her or the officers. But I insisted she needed to see exactly who had orchestrated this nightmare and exactly where they were heading. Rosalind studied my face for a fraction of a second before taking the device from my hand. I watched her eyes track across the glowing screen. She read the arrogant, dismissive words my brother had typed just 30 minutes earlier. "Kids are in a cab to your place. Chloe and I are boarding for Cabo. Deal with it." She looked at the screenshot of the rideshare receipt, noting the pickup location, the drop-off time, and the complete lack of an accompanying adult. The transformation in Rosalind Carter was instantaneous and terrifying. I watched the muscles in her jaw tighten until they trembled. The professional, detached demeanor she had maintained moments before vanished, replaced by a dangerous, icy calm. It was the kind of cold, calculated fury that precedes a devastating legal storm. She was a woman who spent her life fighting for the vulnerable, and she had just read the digital confession of a man treating his own children like inconvenient trash. She handed the phone back to me. She did not blink. She did not offer a word of comfort. Instead, she turned her head slowly, fixing her gaze on the lead police officer standing near the edge of the lawn. Her voice rang out sharp, authoritative, and laced with absolute venom. She ordered the officer to flag the parents' passports immediately. She told him to call the Port Authority and TSA security at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. She looked back at me, her eyes burning with the promise of absolute retribution, and declared that nobody was flying to Cabo today. I watched helplessly as the Child Protective Services worker gently guided Trey and Maya down the concrete steps of Rosalind Carter's duplex. Trey was holding his little sister's hand so tightly his knuckles were white. The social worker, a kind-faced woman who clearly hated this part of her job, looked at me with deep sympathy. She explained that because Jamal had committed a criminal act of abandonment on a stranger's property and I had no legal guardianship paperwork, they had to follow strict county protocol. The children were going into emergency temporary placement. I begged her to let me take them to my car, to just let them sleep in my guest room while we sorted this out. She shook her head, explaining that until a judge cleared a family member, the state had to take custody. She assured me they were going to a safe, licensed emergency foster home equipped for young siblings, but watching my nephew and niece climb into the back of a sterile white county van shattered my heart into 1,000 jagged pieces. I stood on the damp grass, wrapping my arms around myself as the van pulled away, feeling a toxic mixture of profound grief and absolute white-hot rage. The lead Atlanta police officer approached me with a notepad, ready to take my official statement. He looked completely baffled by the entire situation. He asked me the exact question that had been burning in my own mind all morning. He wanted to know what kind of father just packs his offspring into a random ride, texts his sister a screenshot, and boards an international flight to Cabo without a single backward glance. I looked at the officer, my voice steady and completely devoid of any familial warmth. I told him it happens because for 33 years, my parents, Yvonne and Desmond, have treated him like a king and treated me like the janitorial staff. I explained that Jamal operates under the ironclad delusion that the world is his personal playground, and I am merely the hired help expected to sweep up his debris. He assumed I would just magically fix it, because that is the exact dynamic our parents have violently enforced since the day we were born. I told the officer about the endless financial bailouts, the ignored boundaries, and the complete lack of accountability that had forged my brother into a man capable of treating his own flesh and blood like an inconvenience. I made sure to mention Chloe and her constant reliance on weaponized incompetence, always claiming she was simply too stressed by motherhood to function, leaving Jamal to demand that the family step in. The officer simply nodded, writing it all down, his expression shifting from confusion to utter disgust as he asked for my parents' contact information for the official report. Before I could even finish signing the bottom of my statement, my cell phone began to vibrate violently in my pocket. The screen lit up with a photo of my mother, Yvonne. The authorities had initiated their emergency contact protocols. I braced myself, hitting the accept button and bringing the phone to my ear. I expected tears. I expected panic. I expected a grandmother terrified for the safety of her grandchildren who had just been scooped up by the state. Instead, I was met with a deafening, shrill scream that forced me to pull the phone away from my face. Yvonne was not crying for Trey or Maya, she was screaming at me. She demanded to know why the police were calling Desmond and asking about international flight restrictions. She shrieked that Jamal and Chloe were being detained at the airport and missing their first-class flight. Not once did she ask if the children were warm, if they were scared, or if they were safe. Her entire focus was on the disruption of her golden boy's luxury vacation. I cut her off, my voice dropping an octave into a tone she had never heard me use before. I told her that her son had abandoned his kids on a prosecutor's porch and was currently catching a felony charge instead of a flight. Yvonne gasped, but the denial was instantaneous. She started making excuses right there on the phone, twisting the reality of the situation to fit her perfect narrative. She yelled that Chloe gets severe anxiety and needed a break from the kids to save her marriage. She yelled that Jamal works incredibly hard on his entrepreneurial visions and deserves a vacation to decompress. And then came the ultimate slap in the face. She blamed me entirely. She screamed, demanding to know why I did not just stay at the duplex and watch them like a good aunt. She accused me of letting Child Protective Services steal my own blood just to be petty and vindictive. She actually said I was ruining our family reputation over a simple miscommunication because I lacked the maternal instinct to understand how hard parenting is. The sheer delusion was staggering. I stood on the sidewalk listening to this woman protect a man who had committed child abandonment while actively trying to make me the villain of the story. Yvonne demanded that I meet her and Desmond immediately. She ordered me to wait right there at the South Atlanta duplex so we could march down to the police precinct together. Her grand plan was to force the police to release the children back to me, effectively clearing Jamal's name so he could catch the next flight out to Mexico. She was already barking orders at my father in the background, telling him to grab his keys and pull the car around. I let her finish her frantic, unhinged rant. I let the silence hang on the line for 3 long seconds, letting her stew in her own aggressive energy. Then I delivered the reality check she desperately needed. I told her I was not waiting at the duplex because I did not live there anymore. I told her I had moved out 6 months ago, a fact her precious son would have known if he had bothered to speak to me after I cut off his allowance in January. Yvonne stopped dead in her tracks, her shouting instantly replaced by a confused stutter. She demanded to know where I was and why I had kept my new address a secret. I walked back to my car, unlocked the door, and slid into the driver's seat. I told her that if she wanted to scream at me, she could do it at my actual home. I rattled off the address to my luxury high-rise building right in the heart of the most expensive downtown district in Atlanta. I told her to meet me in the main lobby and hung up the phone before she could formulate another excuse. I put my car in drive, leaving the flashing police lights and the imposing figure of the district attorney behind me. I merged back onto the highway, heading toward the gleaming glass skyscrapers of downtown, ready to finally show my parents exactly who they were dealing with and exactly how little power they had over me now. I pulled into the subterranean parking garage of my downtown building. The heavy steel gate rolled shut behind my car with a resounding thud, sealing me inside the pristine climate-controlled facility. I navigated my vehicle into my assigned spot, gripping the steering wheel for one final moment to take a deep, stabilizing breath before stepping out. The drive from South Atlanta had given me just enough time to lock my emotions inside a mental vault. Right now, I could not afford to be the heartbroken aunt weeping over my niece and nephew. I had to be the ruthless forensic corporate accountant. I badged through the reinforced glass doors leading into the grand lobby. The space was a testament to quiet luxury featuring imported marble floors, minimalist velvet seating areas, and a 24-hour concierge desk manned by staff in tailored suits. Standing dead center in all that manufactured serenity were my parents. Yvonne and Desmond were pacing furiously, completely oblivious to the discreet judging stares of the concierge staff and the other affluent residents passing through. The second the polished steel elevator doors closed behind a departing tenant, my mother locked onto me like a heat-seeking missile. She did not ask how I was doing. She did not ask if Trey and Maya were safe, warm, or comforted. She closed the distance between us in seconds, her face twisted in a mask of absolute outrage. Her designer heels clicked aggressively against the marble floor, matching the frantic energy radiating from her entire body. She demanded to know what was wrong with me. Her voice echoed off the high ceilings, loud and completely unhinged. She screamed that I was actively trying to destroy my brother. She yelled that I knew exactly how bad Chloe struggles with her anxiety, that Chloe needed a luxury vacation to reset her mental health, and that Jamal works entirely too hard to be punished like this. Yvonne pointed a shaking finger right at my face, her manicured nail practically grazing my nose. She accused me of letting Child Protective Services steal my own blood just to prove a point. She demanded to know why I did not just stay at the old duplex and wait for the kids like a supportive, loving sister should. She actually told me that I was ruining our family reputation over a simple miscommunication because I lacked the maternal instinct to understand how hard parenting truly is. I did not flinch. I did not lower my gaze. I stood my ground in the center of that lobby and let her finish her frantic, delusional tirade. When she finally paused to take a breath, chest heaving with indignation, I dropped the reality check she desperately needed. I kept my voice cold, steady, and loud enough for my father to hear every single syllable. I told her I moved out of that duplex 6 months ago. I explained that I had packed up my life, bought a new home, and completely relocated across the city. I watched the confusion wash over her face, replacing the anger for just a fraction of a second, and I immediately filled in the blanks. I told her Jamal never bothered to ask for my new address because Jamal had not spoken a single word to me since the second week of January. I reminded her exactly what happened in January. I reminded her how her golden boy had stomped into my old yard throwing a massive embarrassing tantrum because I flat out refused to pay his overdue car note. I refused because his white wife had just posted a massive shopping haul online featuring a designer handbag that cost triple the amount of his missing car payment. I reminded Yvonne that when I closed my wallet and told them to budget their own household, Jamal told me I was dead to him. So I told her I took him at his word. I vanished. He sent his kids to a stranger's house because he treats my existence like a storage unit for his responsibilities, assuming I will always be sitting exactly where he left me waiting to serve him. My father stepped forward then. Desmond had always been the quiet enforcer of my mother's delusions. He ran a hand over his balding head, looking around the high-end lobby, as if just realizing where they were standing and who might be listening. But the temporary embarrassment did not stop him from delivering the most audacious demand I had ever heard in my entire life. He stepped into my personal space, lowering his voice into a harsh, commanding whisper meant to intimidate me into submission. He told me to pick up my phone right now and call the Atlanta Police Department. He ordered me to tell the investigating officers that I simply forgot I was supposed to babysit today. He wanted me to claim that Jamal and Chloe had cleared the drop-off with me days ago, and that the entire situation was just a careless mistake on my end. He actually looked me in the eye and told me to take the blame to clear my brother's name. Desmond said Jamal was on the verge of securing a massive round of funding for his new startup company, and a child endangerment charge would ruin his professional reputation forever. He told me that since I was single and had no children of my own, a minor legal misunderstanding would not ruin my life the way it would ruin Jamal's. He demanded I fall on my sword for a man who had treated his own children like discarded luggage. I looked at the man who helped create me, feeling nothing but profound, absolute disgust. For my entire life, my parents had demanded I sacrifice my peace, my money, and my boundaries to pave the way for Jamal. Now they were literally demanding I commit a felony. As a forensic accountant, I knew exactly what filing a false police report and lying to a district attorney entailed. It was perjury. It was obstruction of justice. It was a fast track to losing my professional licenses and potentially facing prison time. They were perfectly willing to sacrifice my freedom, my career, and my entire future just to save his luxury vacation to Cabo. They wanted me to burn my life to the ground so Jamal could keep taking tequila shots on a beach. I squared my shoulders and looked my father dead in the eye. I told him I would rather set my own money on fire than commit a crime to save a coward. I turned on my heel, walked straight toward the private residential elevators, and pulled my encrypted key fob from my coat pocket. I scanned the fob against the glowing security reader. The heavy brass doors slid open smoothly, revealing the mirrored interior. I looked back at Yvonne and Desmond, who were standing frozen in the lobby, completely stunned that their usual tactics of guilt and intimidation had failed to move me. I told them that if they wanted to keep screaming and demanding I ruin my life, they needed to do it upstairs where building security would not arrest them for disturbing the peace. I stepped into the elevator fully prepared to show them exactly what happens when the scapegoat finally takes control of the narrative. The smooth ascent of the private elevator gave my parents exactly 45 seconds to steep in their own self-righteous anger. I watched the numbers tick upward on the digital display, maintaining a completely neutral expression while Yvonne continued to mutter under her breath about my supposed lack of family loyalty. Desmond stood rigid beside her, his jaw clenched tightly. They were fully prepared to step out of that elevator and continue their campaign of intimidation, demanding that I immediately dial the police and incriminate myself to save their precious son. They were not prepared for the doors to slide open. The brass doors parted with a soft chime, revealing the expansive foyer of my downtown penthouse. I stepped out first, my heels clicking against the imported black marble floor. I did not look back to see if they were following. I simply walked into the main living area, letting the sheer scale of the space do the talking for me. The entire eastern wall consisted of floor-to-ceiling glass, offering an unobstructed panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline. The morning sun poured over the custom white leather furniture, the curated modern art pieces, and the massive quartz kitchen island. It was a space designed for absolute tranquility and undeniable power. I turned around to face them. Yvonne and Desmond had frozen just past the threshold. The furious my mother had been building up in the elevator died instantly in her throat. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, taking in the vaulted ceilings, the floating glass staircase leading to the loft, and the sheer unmistakable cost of everything in her line of sight. Desmond stared at the skyline view, his mouth slightly open. For their entire lives, they had viewed me as the secondary character, the unglamorous workhorse who existed merely to prop up Jamal and his grand entrepreneurial visions. They assumed I lived in a modest, practical apartment, appropriate for a woman who spent all her time crunching numbers. They had absolutely no idea that forensic corporate accounting at my level paid well into the high six figures. They had no idea because they never bothered to ask about my career unless they needed me to audit Jamal's failing business ventures for free. The shock held them captive for exactly 10 seconds before my mother's deeply ingrained toxicity hijacked her brain. Her surprise violently mutated into bitter, twisted resentment. She could not handle the physical proof that I was infinitely more successful than the son she worshipped. She stepped fully into the living room, her heels stomping aggressively against the hardwood floor. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest and sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "So this is why you refuse to give your brother a loan for his new startup," she spat, glaring at my kitchen island as if it had personally offended her. "You were hoarding all this money for yourself to live in a glass castle while your own flesh and blood struggles to build a legacy. You let him drown in stress just so you could buy fancy furniture. You are exactly the selfish, ungrateful daughter I always feared you would become." The sheer audacity of her statement hung in the pristine air of my living room. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I walked over to the quartz counter and poured myself a glass of water, moving with deliberate, unbothered precision. I took a slow sip before setting the glass down and fixing my gaze entirely on her. "I did not give him a loan," I stated, my voice deadly calm, "because the last time I transferred $10,000 of my hard-earned money to save his house from foreclosure. I happened to check social media the very next morning. I watched your face pale as I laid out the facts. I told her that I saw his precious wife Chloe posting a mirror selfie holding a brand new limited edition Chanel handbag that cost exactly $6,000. I reminded Yvonne that when I called her absolutely livid, that my emergency funds were being used to fund Chloe's designer shopping addiction, she did not reprimand her son. Instead, I reminded her, looking her dead in the eye, "You told me to calm down. You told me that Chloe suffers from severe anxiety and needed a little retail therapy to cope with the stress of nearly losing her home. You looked me in my face and told me I needed to be a team player and support my brother's marriage." Desmond tried to interject, stepping forward with his chest puffed out, attempting to play the intimidating patriarch. He told me I had no right to speak to my mother with such disrespect, and that family helps family without keeping score. I held up a single finger, stopping him dead in his tracks. "You do not get to dictate the tone of my voice in a home I bought and paid for," I warned him, my eyes locked onto his. "I spent the last 3 years working 80-hour weeks dismantling corporate fraud and bringing down executives who think the rules do not apply to them. I built this entire empire while you two enabled a grown man who still expects a weekly allowance. The Bank of Kendra is permanently closed. I filed for moral bankruptcy regarding Jamal a long time ago." Yvonne opened her mouth to scream another insult, but a sharp, piercing sound sliced through the heavy tension in the room. It was my phone vibrating rapidly against the quartz countertop. The custom ringtone I had assigned to my brother echoed loudly in the cavernous space. We all stared at the glowing screen. The caller ID displayed Jamal's name in bold black letters. Desmond lurched forward, pointing a trembling finger at the device. "Answer it," he demanded, panic flooding his voice. "Tell him you are sorting this out with the police. Tell him his kids are fine so he can get on his flight." I did not touch the phone immediately. I let it ring 3 times, savoring the absolute desperation radiating from my parents. Then I reached out and tapped the bright green button, putting the call on speakerphone and setting the device back down on the island. The audio filled the room crystal clear. I expected to hear the background noise of an airport terminal. I expected to hear the frantic apologies of a man who had just realized his reckless behavior had caught up with him. I expected him to beg me to go back to the duplex and fix the catastrophic mess he had left on a prosecutor's porch. But Jamal was not calling to apologize. "Kendra, you vindictive piece of trash!" His voice exploded through the speaker, shaking with pure, unadulterated rage. In the background, I could hear the distinct crackle of a police radio and the heavy, authoritative voices of law enforcement officers commanding someone to step back. The airport police had successfully intercepted them right at the departure gate at Hartsfield-Jackson. But Jamal was not calling to beg for my help. He was calling to destroy me. "You told them I abandoned my kids!" he screamed, his voice cracking with panic and fury. "You lied to the cops. I am standing here with border security telling me my passport is flagged and my wife is having a panic attack on the terminal floor because you decided to play games with our lives." I stared at the phone, my forensic mind instantly recognizing the tactic. Jamal was cornered, and like any narcissist facing accountability, he was violently flipping the narrative. I was not calling to ask about the safety of his 4-year-old daughter or his 6-year-old son. He had not asked where they were or who had them. His only concern was that I had somehow victimized him by exposing his actions to the authorities. I was gearing up to launch an offensive strike, so massive he believed it would force me to retreat and take the blame just to make the yelling stop. But he had no idea that I had spent the last 3 years preparing an arsenal specifically designed for this exact moment. I tapped the bright green button on my phone screen and left the device resting on the cool quartz countertop. The pristine silence of my penthouse was instantly shattered by the chaotic background noise of Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. Through the speaker, I could hear the muffled announcements over the public address system, the squeak of rolling luggage, and the heavy, authoritative voices of security personnel trying to maintain order. But cutting through all of that was my brother Jamal. He was not calling to ask if his 6-year-old son and 4-year-old daughter were safe. He had not dialed my number to beg for forgiveness, or to find out if the police had taken them to a warm foster home. Jamal was screaming, his voice cracking with a frantic, high-pitched terror that only comes when a narcissist finally faces a consequence they cannot buy their way out of. "You vindictive piece of trash!" he yelled, his words echoing off my floor-to-ceiling windows. "You told them I abandoned my kids. You lied to the cops. I am standing here with border security telling me my passport is flagged and my wife is having a panic attack on the terminal floor because you decided to play games with our lives." I stared at the phone, my forensic mind instantly recognizing the tactic. Jamal was cornered, and he was violently flipping the narrative. Before I could even formulate a response to his sheer delusion, a new sound flooded the speaker. It was Chloe. My sister-in-law had deployed her ultimate defense mechanism. Her weaponized white woman tears were flowing freely, loud and theatrical enough to ensure every bystander and officer in the terminal viewed her as the ultimate victim. I could hear her sobbing uncontrollably, her voice hitching in that perfectly practiced way she used whenever she wanted to avoid accountability. "She did this to us," Chloe wailed, practically hyperventilating into the phone. "Kendra promised she would be there. She gave us that specific address. She told us she had a surprise for the kids, and to just send them over in a cab because she wanted to treat us to a stress-free morning. She deliberately abandoned our babies to ruin our marriage because she is jealous of our family." The audacity was so staggering it bordered on pathological. I had not spoken a single word to Chloe in 6 months, and here she was weaving a devastatingly detailed lie in front of federal security. My parents, Yvonne and Desmond, leaned closer to the kitchen island, drinking in every word of Chloe's performance as if it were gospel truth. Then the chaotic noise on the other end of the line shifted. A heavy shuffling sound indicated the phone was changing hands. When the next voice spoke, it was deep, stern, and completely devoid of patience. "Ma'am, this is Officer Martinez with the Atlanta Police Department Airport Division," the voice announced. "I am speaking with Kendra, correct?" I kept my tone perfectly level, stripped of all emotion. "Speaking," I replied. Officer Martinez did not mince words. "Ma'am, we currently have your brother and sister-in-law detained at the departure gate due to an active alert placed on their passports by the Fulton County District Attorney's Office. However, your brother has just provided us with physical evidence that significantly alters the context of this situation." I raised an eyebrow, staring at the phone. "What physical evidence, officer?" I have your brother's cellular device in my hand. Officer Martinez stated, his tone shifting from investigative to deeply accusatory. I am currently looking at a text message thread between his number and yours. At 8 o'clock yesterday evening, you explicitly agreed to assume temporary guardianship of the two minors. Your exact text reads, quote, "Sure, send them over to the duplex in a cab. I will be home all day, and I have the guest room set up for them. Go enjoy Cabo," unquote. The room went dead silent. The air in my kitchen suddenly felt too thick to breathe. I stared at the black screen of my phone, my mind racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour. I was entirely thrown off. I knew for an absolute fact that I had never sent those messages. I had not sent a single text to Jamal since January. But Jamal was a desperate man who knew his way around basic software. He had forged the text thread. He had either used a spoofing application to fake a conversation or manipulated a graphic design program to create a flawless screenshot of a fake interaction. He had fabricated digital evidence to frame me for his crime. Based on this evidence, officer, Martinez continued, his voice hardening, you accepted responsibility for those children and then willfully abandoned them on a stranger's property. I am informing you that the narrative has shifted. You are now officially under investigation for criminal child neglect and reckless endangerment. We are dispatching a unit to your current location to ask you some very serious questions. I suggest you do not leave the premises. The call disconnected with a sharp click. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. I stood frozen for a fraction of a second, the sheer gravity of the situation washing over me. I was a corporate forensic accountant. My entire career, my licenses, my livelihood depended on an immaculate background check. A criminal investigation for child endangerment would result in immediate termination from my firm and the permanent revocation of my professional credentials. Jamal had not just tried to pass off his parenting duties. He had actively orchestrated a plan to destroy my life to save his own skin. But the true betrayal did not come from the phone call. It came from the two people standing right in front of me. I slowly lifted my gaze from the phone and looked at my parents. I expected them to be horrified. I expected them to be outraged that their son had just lied to law enforcement and framed their daughter for a felony. Instead, Desmond stepped forward, his shoulders dropping in a strange display of relief. He let out a long, heavy sigh and looked at me with an expression that made my blood run entirely cold. He did not look at me like a father looking at his child. He looked at me like a manager looking at a disposable employee. "Kendra, listen to me," Desmond said, his voice dropping into a low, urgent plea. "This is actually a blessing in disguise. We can fix this right now before it gets out of hand." I stared at him, my voice dangerously quiet. "Fix this how exactly?" "You just need to take the charge, Kendra," he said, stepping closer to the island, his eyes pleading with me to be reasonable. "Just tell the officers when they get here that you sent those texts, and you simply forgot the children were coming. Tell them you got overwhelmed with your fancy accounting job and made a mistake. It is just a misdemeanor for you, a slap on the wrist." I felt the floor drop out from beneath me. "You want me to confess to a crime I did not commit?" I asked, every syllable dripping with absolute venom. "You want me to tell the police that I abandoned my niece and nephew on a porch?" Yvonne pushed past my father, slamming her hands down on my pristine quartz countertops. "You are a single woman with no children," she screamed, her face red with desperate fury. "You live in a multi-million-dollar penthouse. You can afford the best defense lawyers in the state to get the record expunged. But Jamal is a father. He is on the verge of securing his Series A funding for his new company. A felony child endangerment charge will completely ruin his career. His investors will pull out. His life will be over." Desmond nodded vigorously, leaning in to apply more pressure. "Be the bigger person, Kendra. You have all this wealth, all this privilege. You owe it to this family to protect your brother. If you just take the blame, they will let him and Chloe get on their flight and this whole nightmare will be over. You are strong enough to handle a little legal trouble. Jamal is too fragile for prison." I looked back and forth between the two of them, absorbing the sheer, unadulterated madness of their demand. They were actively begging me to sacrifice my freedom, my pristine criminal record, and my entire corporate career just to maintain the illusion of their golden boy's perfection. They wanted me to burn my empire to ashes, so Jamal could go drink margaritas on a beach in Mexico. They were perfectly willing to throw me to the wolves to save a man who had forged evidence to frame me. The last remaining thread of familial obligation inside my heart snapped. It did not break with a tragic, tearful realization. It shattered with the cold, calculated precision of a woman who had just realized she was surrounded by enemies. I looked at my parents taking in their desperate, entitled faces, and I knew exactly what I had to do. They wanted to play a game of legal chess with a woman who dismantled fraudulent corporations for a living. They had no idea. I had spent the last 3 years building a digital arsenal designed to absolutely annihilate anyone who tried to cross my bottom line. I looked at the two people standing in my kitchen and felt a wave of absolute chilling disgust wash over me. Desmond stood there with his chest puffed out, actually believing his demand was entirely reasonable. Yvonne was nodding along with him, her eyes wide with a manic, desperate hope. They were staring at me like I was a human shield they could just toss in front of a moving train to stop it from hitting their golden boy. They wanted me to throw away my certified public accountant license, my certified fraud examiner credentials, and my flawless corporate background check. They wanted me to walk into a police station and confess to abandoning two toddlers on a senior prosecutor's porch, completely ignoring the fact that the criminal justice system does not hand out gentle slaps on the wrist to Black women who admit to child endangerment. Desmond took another step forward, misinterpreting my silence as hesitation. He lowered his voice, trying to sound like a rational patriarch dispensing tough but necessary advice. He told me that Jamal was right on the cusp of securing his Series A funding, that his tech startup was going to be the vehicle that finally created true generational wealth for our name. He actually fixed his mouth to say that since my career was already established and I had no husband or children to worry about, taking a minor hit on my record was the honorable familial thing to do. He said I could afford a good lawyer to sweep it under the rug quietly, but Jamal could not afford a felony ruining his public image before his investor meetings. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not waste my breath trying to explain the fundamental foundational insanity of their request. I simply lifted the phone back up to my face. Officer Martinez was still on the line, the chaotic background noise of the airport terminal buzzing through the speaker. I could still hear Chloe in the distance performing her hysterical, breathless weeping for an audience of TSA agents. I bypassed my parents entirely and spoke directly into the device. My voice cut through the air with absolute razor-sharp precision, entirely stripped of fear. I am heading down to the main precinct right now. I told the officer, my tone leaving absolutely no room for debate, and I am bringing my corporate defense attorney. Hold them. I tapped the red button to disconnect the call. Yvonne let out a guttural, high-pitched shriek. She lunged forward, her hands grasping at the air over my kitchen island, as if she could physically snatch the words back out of the room. She screamed that I was a traitor, that I was sentencing my own brother to prison out of sheer petty jealousy. Desmond stepped directly into my path, his face turning a dangerous, volatile shade of crimson. He raised his hand, pointing a thick finger right between my eyes, ordering me to pick the phone back up and fix what I had just done. I did not flinch. I did not retreat a single inch. I pointed directly at the heavy brass doors of my private elevator. "Get out of my house," I commanded. Desmond planted his feet, his jaw set. He told me they were not going anywhere until I called the precinct back and took responsibility for the text messages. He told me I owed this family my loyalty, and that I was not leaving this penthouse until I did exactly as I was told. I maintained intense, unbroken eye contact with him as I slowly reached over to the sleek digital intercom panel mounted on the wall beside my refrigerator. I pressed the silver button for the 24-hour concierge desk. A polite, professional voice answered immediately through the overhead speakers. I requested that building security be sent up to my penthouse floor immediately to remove two hostile, unwanted trespassers who were refusing to vacate the premises. Yvonne gasped, taking a sudden stumbling step backward. Her hands flew up to clutch her chest. Desmond dropped his pointing finger, his bravado evaporating the exact second he realized I was treating him like a common criminal in a high-end building. They knew the caliber of security in this high-rise. They knew armed guards would step off that elevator in less than 2 minutes and physically drag them out in front of the entire lobby. The realization that they possessed absolutely zero power over me in this space finally penetrated their thick, entitled skulls. Yvonne grabbed her designer purse from the counter, her face twisting into a mask of pure vitriolic hatred. She told me I was a monster. She told me I would die alone in this glass cage with all my money, because I had no heart. They scrambled into the elevator, retreating like beaten dogs, cursing my name as the brass doors slid shut and sealed them away. The moment the penthouse was silent again, I did not waste a single second celebrating the victory. The clock was ticking, and Jamal had just escalated a family dispute into a federal legal battle by forging digital evidence and filing a false report with airport police. He thought he was playing a clever game, assuming I would panic at the threat of law enforcement and fold under the pressure. He assumed my silence over the last 6 months was a sign of weakness or retreat. I was dead wrong. I walked purposefully out of the kitchen and down the wide, sunlit hallway into my master bedroom. I headed straight for my custom walk-in closet, pushing past rows of tailored corporate suits and designer shoes until I reached the back wall. Hidden discreetly behind a full-length mirror was a heavy biometric steel safe bolted directly into the concrete foundation of the building. I pressed my thumb against the glowing green scanner and punched in the complex 8-digit passcode. The heavy locking mechanism clicked and I pulled the reinforced steel door open. Inside, resting, neatly next to my passport, my property deeds and bundles of emergency cash, was my iPad Pro and a thick, heavy black leather-bound dossier. I pulled the dossier out, feeling the substantial, satisfying weight of it in my hands. I placed it on the center island of my custom closet and ran my hand over the smooth leather cover. Jamal and my parents thought I only investigated corporate mergers and acquisitions. They thought my skills as a forensic accountant were strictly reserved for my wealthy clients and massive boardroom audits. They had absolutely no idea that for the last 3 years I had been quietly, ruthlessly, and methodically auditing my own family. It started 3 years ago when I noticed a strange, unauthorized hard inquiry on my credit report. Jamal had tried to use my social security number to secure a business loan for one of his failing ventures, assuming I would never notice, or that I would simply let it slide to keep the peace. I shut it down immediately, placed a permanent freeze on my credit, and decided right then and there that I could never trust the people who shared my blood. From that day forward, I began tracking every single financial tie, every transaction, every digital footprint, connecting my brother, his wife, and our parents. I utilized my specialized software and my deep understanding of financial forensics to monitor public records, property deeds, and the flow of money within our family structure. I gathered bank statements, tax records, and wire transfer receipts that my parents had foolishly asked me to help them organize in the past. I compiled a mountain of explosive, undeniable evidence, storing it away as an insurance policy in case they ever tried to ruin me to save him. I flipped open the heavy leather cover. The dossier was meticulously organized with color-coded tabs. Tab 1 contained certified data logs regarding my personal communications. Tab 2 contained detailed financial breakdowns of Jamal and Chloe's lavish lifestyle, explicitly highlighting the massive discrepancy between their reported income and their actual spending. Tab 3 contained the darkest, most devastating secret of all. A secret I had uncovered just 8 months ago regarding my parents' retirement accounts and Chloe's offshore banking habits. I snapped the dossier shut. Jamal thought he was a mastermind for faking a few text messages on a spoofing app. He thought he had outsmarted me and backed me into a corner where I had no choice but to surrender. I grabbed the dossier and my iPad, tucking them firmly under my arm. I walked over to my vanity and began changing into a razor-sharp, tailored charcoal power suit. I was not walking into that police precinct as a scared, confused sister trying to explain away a misunderstanding. I was walking in as a highly trained financial predator, fully armed and ready for absolute war. I was about to use every single page of this dossier to burn his entire world to ashes. I tossed my phone onto the duvet and immediately dialed Elias. The line barely rang twice before his crisp, baritone voice filled the room. Elias was not a family law attorney. He was a ruthless corporate defense litigator who usually spent his days dismantling federal embezzlement charges and negotiating 8-figure settlements. He hated bullies, despised entitlement, and charged executives sweat. He had also been my mentor when I first entered the forensic accounting world, and he knew exactly how my family operated. I put him on speakerphone and began undressing, laying out the facts with clinical precision. I told him about the phantom drop-off at the duplex district attorney, Rosalind Carter, stepping onto her porch, the involvement of Child Protective Services, and the fabricated text messages Jamal had presented to the airport police to frame me for child abandonment. Elias let out a low, dark chuckle that vibrated through the speaker. He told me that Jamal had essentially handed us the keys to his own destruction. Filing a false police report is a crime, but forging digital evidence to frame a licensed forensic accountant and triggering a federal airport security hold is an entirely different level of stupidity. He instructed me to gather my physical evidence and meet him at the main downtown precinct in exactly 45 minutes. He promised me that by the time we were finished, my brother would be begging for a public defender. I ended the call and turned my attention to my wardrobe. My parents wanted to treat me like the disposable scapegoat who would crumble and take a criminal charge while wearing sweatpants and a panicked expression. I refused to give them that satisfaction. I walked into my closet and pulled out a bespoke tailored crimson pantsuit. It was an outfit I reserved for hostile boardroom takeovers and depositions. I slipped into a crisp white silk blouse and stepped into a pair of black leather stilettos that echoed against the hardwood floor like a gavel striking a sound block. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, flawless style. I looked in the mirror and saw a woman who was completely untouchable. With my armor secured, I sat down at my vanity desk and opened my secure encrypted laptop. Because of my high-level corporate credentials and security clearances, I utilized enterprise-level software to manage my cellular data and digital communications. It took me less than 3 minutes to bypass the standard consumer portals and pull the raw certified transmission logs for my phone number directly from the carrier servers. The data exported into a pristine time-stamped spreadsheet bearing the official digital seal of the telecom provider. I filtered the log for the last 48 hours. The screen displayed absolute, undeniable proof. There was a complete void of outgoing communication from my device to Jamal's number. The texts he had shown the airport police did not exist in the carrier's mainframe. I had used a cheap third-party spoofing application to generate a fake conversation completely ignorant of the fact that digital forensics leaves a permanent, irreversible trail. I printed 3 copies of the certified log and slid them into a sleek black folder. Next, I turned my attention to the heavy leather dossier I had retrieved from my safe. I flipped past the initial tabs documenting the unpaid loans and ignored boundaries, navigating straight to the section labeled with a bright red tab. I called it the Cabo Fund. For months, Jamal and his white wife, Chloe, had been crying poverty to anyone who would listen. Chloe constantly complained on her social media platforms about the staggering cost of organic groceries and the immense stress of maintaining her lifestyle on a single income, while Jamal supposedly poured his blood, sweat, and tears into getting his tech startup off the ground. My parents had used this exact narrative to guilt-trip me, demanding I subsidize their household so my niece and nephew would not suffer. But numbers do not have emotions and bank statements do not lie. I opened the dossier and reviewed the financial mapping I had quietly conducted over the past 8 months. I had traced the flow of capital running through our family structure, and the reality was sickening. Jamal was not struggling to secure funding. He had fraudulently opened 3 separate high-yield lines of credit using Desmond and Yvonne's social security numbers and forged signatures. My parents were entirely unaware that their pristine credit scores were currently buckling under $90,000 of unsecured debt. But the most devastating piece of evidence was reserved for Chloe. She loved to play the overwhelmed, fragile victim, using her weaponized tears to manipulate my parents into believing she was barely surviving. Yet my audit revealed a deeply sinister pattern. I looked at the printed wire transfer confirmations. Chloe had gained access to Yvonne's primary retirement account under the guise of helping my mother set up a new online banking portal. For the last 6 months, Chloe had been systematically siphoning funds in increments just small enough to avoid triggering automatic bank fraud alerts. She was funneling my mother's life savings directly into a secret offshore account registered in the Cayman Islands. That was how they afforded a $15,000 luxury vacation to Mexico. They were not just abandoning their children on a porch. They were actively bankrupting my parents to fund their delusions of grandeur. As I organized the paperwork and slid the dossier into my leather briefcase, my phone began to vibrate violently against the desk. The screen lit up with a relentless barrage of notifications. The family group chat, which had been silent toward me for half a year, was suddenly exploding. I picked up the device and watched the messages roll in. My Aunt Patrice texted asking how I could be so heartless to let the state take my own flesh and blood. My cousin Kevin sent a message calling me a sellout, accusing me of thinking I was better than the rest of the family just because I lived downtown. The flying monkeys were assembling, operating on whatever twisted, fabricated version of events my mother had just fed them. I opened my Facebook app to see exactly what narrative Yvonne was spinning. Right at the top of my feed was a fresh status update from my mother, posted just 10 minutes after I kicked her out of my penthouse. It was a masterpiece of vague, manipulative social media warfare. "Nothing hurts worse than a daughter who turns her back on her own blood," the post read. "We gave her everything, and today she repaid us with the ultimate betrayal. Please pray for my grandbabies. They are in the hands of the system because the person who was supposed to protect them chose spite over family. God sees all." Below the status, dozens of comments from extended relatives and church friends were already piling up, offering prayers and condemning my supposed cruelty. They were calling me bitter, cold, and unnatural. They were rallying around Yvonne, completely ignorant to the fact that the golden son she was protecting had just framed me for a crime while simultaneously draining her retirement fund to zero. I did not type a reply. I did not engage in a public argument in the comment section. I simply took a screenshot of the post capturing every single defamatory word and emailed it directly to Elias. This was no longer just a family dispute. This was defamation of character, and I was going to make sure the legal consequences burned through every branch of our family tree. I locked my phone, slid it into my briefcase, and grabbed my keys. The time for entertaining their delusions had officially expired. I strode out of my penthouse, the heavy door locking securely behind me. The elevator ride down to this parking garage felt entirely different this time. I was no longer the panicked, heartbroken aunt rushing to clean up a mess. I was a professional operating at the absolute peak of my capabilities, holding the power to dismantle their entire reality. I walked across the concrete floor of the garage and slid into the driver's seat of my car. The engine purred to life, a low, powerful rumble that matched the steady, calculated rhythm of my heart. I pulled out of the parking structure and merged onto the bustling downtown streets, steering my vehicle directly toward the main police precinct. I was not playing defense anymore. I was going on the offensive, and I was bringing absolute hell with me. I pulled my car into the visitor lot of the main downtown precinct. The gray concrete building stood like a cold monument to bad decisions and broken lives. I stepped out of my vehicle feeling absolutely none of the intimidation this structure usually provoked. My bespoke crimson suit acted as both a shield and a blazing warning sign. Every step I took toward the heavy glass doors was precise and measured. Elias was already waiting for me in the main lobby. He wore a custom navy suit and a predatory smile that told me he was ready to dismantle anyone who stepped into his path. He did not ask how I was feeling or offer empty platitudes. He simply checked his silver wristwatch and told me the lead detective was ready for us. We walked down the sterile, brightly lit corridor together. The smell of cheap bleach floor wax and stale coffee hung heavy in the air. Sitting on a rigid plastic bench just outside the interrogation rooms were my parents. Yvonne and Desmond leaped to their feet the exact second they saw me approaching. Their faces were twisted into identical masks of furious entitlement. They had spent their entire lives treating this exact scenario as a minor inconvenience, smoothing over every disastrous mistake my brother ever made. Yvonne stepped directly into my path, blocking the hallway. She hissed under her breath, demanding I tell the officers I made a terrible mistake. She told me to stop this ridiculous, dramatic charade right now and get her son out of this filthy building. Desmond glared at Elias, attempting to puff out his chest to intimidate a man who routinely destroyed billionaire executives during hostile depositions. Desmond told me that I owed this family my protection and that I needed to walk into that room and fix the misunderstanding before Jamal lost his startup funding. I did not break my stride. I did not even blink. I looked right through my parents as if they were made of cheap glass. Elias placed a firm hand on the door handle of interrogation room B and pushed it open, holding it wide so I could step inside. The atmosphere inside the small, windowless room was thick with misplaced confidence. Jamal sat leaning back in a metal chair with his legs crossed casually at the ankle. He looked like a wealthy tourist waiting for a hotel valet rather than a suspect facing serious felony charges. Beside him sat his wife, Chloe. She had clearly spent the last hour perfecting her delicate victim routine. Her makeup was strategically smudged, and she was clutching a crumpled tissue tightly to her chest. She let out a soft, pathetic sniffle, the exact second I walked through the door, ensuring everyone in the room noticed her distress. But my eyes immediately locked onto the woman sitting at the head of the long metal table. District Attorney Rosalind Carter was not dressed in her weekend emerald silk robe anymore. She wore a tailored black blazer that commanded absolute, unquestionable authority. Her presence in a standard precinct interrogation room was highly unusual but entirely justified. The crime had occurred on her private property. She had personally ordered the authorities to flag my brother's passport, and she was sitting here today to ensure the criminal justice system did exactly what it was designed to do. She gave me a brief, imperceptible nod. She recognized another black woman who absolutely did not play games. To her right sat the lead detective. He looked thoroughly exhausted, holding a thick manila folder and a digital voice recorder. He gestured for Elias and me to take the empty seats directly across from Jamal and Chloe. We sat down. I placed my heavy black leather dossier directly onto the center of the metal table. The sound of the thick leather hitting the steel echoed loudly in the small room, drawing everyone's attention to the mysterious binder. The detective cleared his throat and initiated the formal recording process. He stated the date, the time, and the full names of everyone present for the official record. He looked at me with the specific, exhausted skepticism reserved for people he assumed were wasting police resources. He stated plainly that my brother had made a very serious allegation regarding the events of the morning. He told me that Jamal had provided digital evidence proving I had explicitly agreed to take custody of his two minor children before they were placed into a commercial rideshare vehicle. The detective opened his manila folder. He pulled out 3 sheets of paper printed with full-color screenshots. He slid them across the cold metal table toward me. I looked down at the papers without touching them. They were printouts of a text message thread supposedly between my phone number and Jamal's phone number. The timestamps were meticulously coordinated to align with the events of the previous evening. The outgoing message from Jamal read that he and Chloe desperately needed a mental health break and asked if I could please take the kids for the week. The incoming message displaying my exact contact information and phone number contained a response I supposedly typed back to him. It read, "Sure, send them over to the duplex. I will be home all day, and I have the guest room set up for them. Go enjoy Cabo." I stared at the printed lies, analyzing them with the cold, calculating eye of a forensic auditor. Jamal had always been incredibly lazy, but he possessed a very specific kind of desperate cunning when it came to avoiding accountability. He had clearly used a spoofing application to generate this entire conversation. He knew exactly what phrases would make me look like a willing participant who simply changed her mind and callously abandoned her family. I knew my parents would believe this narrative instantly because it fit their lifelong comfortable belief that I was the cold, unfeeling daughter who constantly disappointed them by refusing to cater to their needs. Jamal leaned forward, resting his elbows on the metal table. The smirk on his face was so massive it practically radiated arrogance through the room. He looked at the lead detective and then pointed a finger directly at me across the table. "See," he said, his voice dripping with arrogant vindication. "She agreed to take them. I told you she agreed. She is just crazy and trying to ruin my life because she is jealous that Chloe and I have a beautiful, happy family." Chloe nodded vigorously, right on cue, dabbing at her completely dry eyes with her crumpled tissue. She let out another theatrical sob, whispering that I had deliberately planned this to get them arrested and destroy their marriage. I did not raise my voice to defend myself. I did not express outrage or try to aggressively defend my character to the detective. I knew that reacting with emotion was exactly what they wanted me to do. They wanted me to look unstable and defensive so their lies would seem more credible. Instead, I leaned back in my chair, matching my brother's relaxed posture perfectly. I looked at Jamal and allowed a slow, chilling smile to spread across my face. I turned my attention to Elias. My attorney simply adjusted his expensive French cuffs and gave me a slight approving nod. I reached out and unlatched the heavy brass lock on my pristine leather-bound dossier. The heavy brass lock on my leather-bound dossier clicked open with a sharp metallic snap that echoed like a gunshot in the sterile interrogation room. I did not rush. I slowly peeled back the thick cover, revealing the meticulously organized contents within. The color-coded tabs lined the edge like a menu of absolute destruction. I located the first tab, the one marked with a crisp white label for telecommunications data. I slid a thick stack of high-grade watermarked paper from the binding and handed it directly to Elias. My attorney did not offer a polite smile. Elias possessed the kind of ruthless courtroom presence that made federal prosecutors sweat, and right now he was operating at peak efficiency. He took the stack of documents and tapped them once against the metal table to square the edges. Then he slid them across the cold steel surface directly over the cheap, flimsy printouts Jamal had just presented to the lead detective. Detective Elias began his baritone, voice filling the small room with absolute authority. What you are currently looking at are the certified cellular provider data logs for my client's mobile device, covering the last 90 days. These are not standard consumer billing statements. These are raw subpoena-grade transmission records pulled directly from the carrier's enterprise server mainframe. You will notice the digital seal and the time-stamped notarization on the final page, verifying their authenticity under penalty of perjury. The detective frowned, picking up the thick stack of papers. He adjusted his posture, leaning forward to scrutinize the tightly printed rows of data. Elias continued pasting his words to ensure every single syllable landed with maximum impact. My client is a senior forensic corporate accountant who holds high-level security clearances. Her digital footprint is monitored and archived with banking-level encryption. If you review the data logs for the time period in question, specifically 8 o'clock yesterday evening, you will find a complete and total void of outgoing or incoming communication between my client's device and the number registered to her brother. Jamal's arrogant smirk froze. The confident slouched posture he had been maintaining suddenly looked incredibly stiff. He blinked rapidly, staring at the stack of papers in the detective's hands as if they were actively on fire. "Let me be perfectly clear," Elias stated, leaning over the table and looking dead into the detective's eyes. "My client did not send those text messages. She did not receive those text messages. The conversation your suspect just presented to you as evidence is a complete digital fabrication. Our independent forensic analysis indicates that he utilized a third-party spoofing application to generate a fake interface, simulating a conversation that never actually occurred. He typed those responses to himself, screenshot the fake interaction, and printed it out to hand to a sworn officer of the law. The silence in the interrogation room became so heavy it felt physically oppressive. The detective slowly lowered the certified data logs and looked up at Jamal. The weary skepticism that had previously colored the detective's face completely vanished, replaced by the hardened, dangerous glare of a cop who had just realized a suspect was actively trying to make a fool out of him. Jamal swallowed audibly. The sound was loud enough to be captured by the digital voice recorder sitting in the center of the table. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The golden child who had spent 35 years talking his way out of every academic failure and financial disaster had suddenly run out of script. He looked frantically toward the hallway, where our parents Yvonne and Desmond were pacing on the other side of the glass, but there was no mother to swoop in and coddle him now. Sitting at the head of the table, District Attorney Rosalind Carter leaned forward. She laced her fingers together, resting them on the metal surface. Her dark eyes locked onto Jamal with the kind of predatory focus that ended careers and revoked liberties. When she spoke, her voice was dangerously soft, a quiet storm gathering absolute power. "Falsifying digital evidence to frame an innocent party is a felony." Rosalind stated her words, slicing through the tension like a scalpel. Presenting that fabricated evidence to a law enforcement officer in an active investigation is filing a false police report. That is another felony. And all of this was done to cover up the fact that you abandoned two vulnerable toddlers on my private property, which constitutes criminal child endangerment. You did not just make a poor parenting decision today. You have actively orchestrated a multi-layered criminal conspiracy. Jamal visibly shrank in his metal chair. His broad shoulders collapsed inward, and a thin sheen of nervous sweat broke out across his forehead. He stammered, raising his hands in a weak, defensive gesture. He tried to claim there was a misunderstanding, that maybe his phone was hacked, or there was a glitch in the messaging network. The excuses spilling from his mouth were so pathetic, so remarkably juvenile, that it was almost embarrassing to witness. I was throwing out the kind of lies a middle school student uses to get out of detention, completely oblivious to the fact that he was sitting across from a seasoned homicide detective and a senior prosecutor who specialized in dismantling organized crime. That was the exact moment the sinking ship finally cracked in half. Chloe had been sitting beside Jamal, clutching her crumpled tissue and maintaining her delicate wounded bird routine. But Chloe was highly attuned to the shifting dynamics of power and consequence. She took one look at the certified data logs, one look at the murderous expression on the detective's face, and one look at the district attorney calculating prison sentences, and she immediately calculated her own survival rate. Her survival strategy involved throwing her husband directly into the propeller blades. "I did not know!" Chloe shrieked, her voice pitching upward into a frantic, hysterical wail. She dropped her crumpled tissue and shoved her chair away from Jamal, putting as much physical distance between them as the small interrogation room would allow. Her weaponized white woman tears transformed from a tool of manipulation into a desperate flood of self-preservation. "I had no idea. He faked those text messages," she sobbed, pointing a trembling manicured finger directly at her husband's face. Jamal told me she agreed. He walked into the kitchen, showed me the screen, and said your sister was thrilled to take the kids. I believed him. You have to believe me. I would never abandon my babies if I knew she was not expecting them. I am a good mother. We were just so overwhelmed. We just needed a vacation to save our marriage, because Jamal has been so stressed about his startup funding, and he promised me he had everything handled. I am a victim here too." Jamal stared at his wife in absolute horror. The betrayal registering on his face was a portrait of pure shock. He reached a hand out toward her, stammering her name, begging her to stop talking, but Chloe shrank away from him as if he were radioactive. She continued sobbing to the detective, claiming she was completely ignorant of the spoofing app and entirely innocent of the criminal conspiracy. She was desperately peddling the narrative that she was just a fragile, overwhelmed wife who had blindly trusted her deceitful husband. The detective watched her performance with a blank, unreadable expression. Rosalind Carter simply raised an eyebrow, thoroughly unimpressed by the theatrical display of marital treason. I sat across the table, watching the implosion of their flawless facade with absolute emotional detachment. Chloe thought her panicked confession would grant her immunity. She thought that by throwing Jamal to the wolves, she could separate herself from the financial and legal ruin that was about to rain down upon this room. She actually believed that her tears would wash away her complicity. She had absolutely no idea that her fabricated ignorance was useless. She thought the text messages were the only weapon I had brought to this fight. She thought the child abandonment charge was the ceiling of their exposure. I did not raise my voice. I did not interrupt her frantic sobbing. I simply let her cry into the sterile air of the precinct until she had to pause to catch her breath. When the room fell quiet save for her exaggerated hiccups, I leaned forward. I looked directly at Chloe, stripping away every ounce of sympathy from my gaze. I placed my hand on the thick, heavy pages of my dossier. I bypassed the tab containing the telecommunications data and ran my manicured finger down the edge until I reached the bright red tab labeled the Cabo Fund. I flipped the heavy page over, revealing the meticulously organized financial spreadsheets, the unauthorized credit applications, and the international wire transfer receipts. I had spent the last 8 months quietly compiling. I looked up from the documents, my expression completely void of mercy. Chloe thought she could play the victim, but I was about to prove that she was the architect of an entirely different kind of destruction. I took a slow, deliberate breath and prepared to deliver the final killing blow. I let the silence hang in the interrogation room for a few seconds, allowing the weight of Chloe and her frantic sobbing to fully saturate the space. She genuinely believed that playing the terrified, manipulated wife would shield her from the incoming devastation. I looked at her with absolutely zero pity. My gaze was so cold and unyielding that her theatrical crying began to falter, dissolving into nervous, uneven hiccups. I placed my hand flat on the center of my open leather dossier, right on top of the bright red tab I had meticulously labeled the Cabo Fund. By the way, I asked, my voice echoing clearly off the concrete walls. Did anyone in this room pause to ask how an unemployed entrepreneur whose tech startup has generated exactly zero revenue and a part-time yoga instructor who teaches 2 classes a week managed to afford a $15,000 VIP vacation to Cabo? The lead detective narrowed his eyes, leaning forward in his chair. District Attorney Rosalind Carter tilted her head, her razor-sharp instincts immediately picking up on the shift in my tone. She knew exactly what a forensic corporate accountant sounded like when they were about to present an airtight financial indictment. Jamal scoffed, attempting to muster a shred of his usual arrogance, though his voice shook visibly. "We saved up for it," he stammered, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "It is none of your business how we finance our marriage, Kendra. You are just bitter because you sit in an office all day while we actually experience the world." I did not even look at him. I kept my eyes locked on his wife. I flipped the heavy page of the dossier over, revealing a thick stack of high-resolution printed spreadsheets, bank statements, and credit applications. I slid the first batch of documents across the metal table directly toward the lead detective and the district attorney. "Actually, Jamal, it became my business during tax season," I stated calmly. "Our parents asked me to help them organize their financial disclosures back in April because they were confused about some unusual mail they had been receiving. As a certified fraud examiner, I tend to notice discrepancies that standard accounting software might overlook." I pointed a manicured finger at the top document. "Those are the finalized credit reports for Desmond and Yvonne. You will notice 3 high-yield unsecured lines of credit opened within the last 9 months. The total outstanding balance across those 3 accounts is exactly $94,000. The detective scanned the papers, his brow furrowing deeply. He looked up at Jamal. "Your parents opened these accounts for you?" he asked. "No," I replied before Jamal could form a lie. "My parents are entirely unaware that these accounts exist. If you look at the origination IP addresses on those digital applications, they wrote directly back to the residential router at Jamal and Chloe's house. The signature blocks utilize forged electronic authorizations. Jamal used his own parents' social security numbers to illegally secure nearly $100,000 in credit to fund his lavish lifestyle and keep up the illusion that his startup was succeeding." A sharp gasp echoed from the open doorway of the interrogation room. I did not have to turn around to know that Desmond and Yvonne were standing right there, listening to every single word. The officers had left the door cracked open, allowing my parents to hear the full, unvarnished truth about their precious golden boy. Jamal slammed his hands down on the metal table, his face turning a chaotic shade of gray. "It was a bridge loan," he shouted desperately, looking between the detective and the door. "I was going to pay it all back the exact second my Series A funding cleared. It is family money. You cannot criminalize a family loan. I just needed runway capital to scale my business." Elias, my attorney, let out a low, humorless laugh. "That is not a runway capital loan," he said, his voice dripping with professional disdain. "That is aggravated identity theft and first-degree financial fraud. You stole your parents' identities to finance a lifestyle you could not afford. The funding was never coming and you knew it." The lead detective began writing furiously on his legal pad. The child endangerment case, now rapidly expanding into a massive white-collar criminal investigation. But I was not finished. The identity theft was just the appetizer. The real kill shot was reserved for the woman sitting across from me, who thought she could cry her way out of federal prison. I picked up the second stack of documents from the red tab and slid them deliberately across the table, placing them directly in front of Chloe. Her blue eyes widened in sheer panic as she looked down at the highlighted bank logos and the long strings of international routing numbers. You think you are safe because Jamal executed the credit applications, I said, my voice dropping into a deadly quiet register. You think you can sit here and play the innocent, fragile victim who was completely ignorant of her husband's financial crimes. But you and I both know you are the actual architect of this bankruptcy, Chloe. Chloe swallowed hard, shrinking back into her metal chair. I do not know what those are, she whispered, her voice trembling violently. I do not handle our finances. I tapped the top sheet of paper. Those are international wire transfer logs, I explained, making sure my words carried out into the hallway. 8 months ago, you generously offered to help my mother set up a new online banking portal because she was struggling with the interface. You sat at her kitchen table and linked her primary retirement savings account to her checking account. But you did not stop there. Rosalind Carter leaned in, her prosecutor instincts fully engaged. What exactly am I looking at here, Kendra? She asked, her eyes scanning the meticulous forensic trail I had mapped out on the spreadsheet. You are looking at textbook financial structuring, I answered, addressing the district attorney directly. For the past 8 months, Chloe has been systematically siphoning funds out of my mother's retirement account. She executed the transfers in randomized increments, ranging from $7,000 to $9,000, specifically designed to stay under the $10,000 federal reporting threshold that triggers automatic bank fraud alerts. It is a money laundering technique commonly known as smurfing. The color completely drained from Chloe's face. She looked like she was going to be physically sick right there in the interrogation room. I pointed to the final column on the spreadsheet. She funneled those stolen retirement funds through a series of domestic shell accounts before wiring the money directly into a secret offshore banking account registered in the Cayman Islands. An account that is registered solely under her maiden name. The silence that followed was absolute and terrifying. The only sound in the room was the heavy mechanical hum of the precinct air conditioning unit. She did not just steal from them, I continued, delivering the final devastating blow. She completely drained their entire life savings to zero. My parents are completely bankrupt. That $15,000 VIP trip to Cabo was financed by the last remaining drops of my mother's retirement fund. The room exploded. Chloe leaped out of her chair, the metal legs scraping violently against the linoleum floor. Her weaponized tears instantly vanished, replaced by the frantic, cornered energy of a trapped animal. She pointed a shaking hand at Jamal, screaming at the top of her lungs. "He made me do it!" She shrieked, her voice echoing deafeningly in the small space. "He told me his parents wanted to invest in his company. He said they authorized the transfers to help us survive. He threatened to leave me and take the kids if I did not help him secure the money. I was just following his instructions. I am a victim of financial abuse." Jamal shot up from his seat, his face contorted in absolute rage. He slammed his fists on the table, knocking the forged text message printouts onto the floor. "You greedy, lying gold digger!" he roared, lunging toward her before the lead detective physically shoved him back into his chair. "You told me you were managing the household budget. You threatened to file for divorce and take the kids out of state if I did not provide you with luxury vacations and designer clothes. You drained my parents dry to fund your own secret escape account." They tore into each other with a vicious, ugly ferocity, screaming accusations and exposing every toxic, manipulative secret of their marriage. They were throwing each other directly under the bus, desperate to avoid the federal charges they both knew were coming. The facade of the perfect golden couple completely disintegrated, replaced by two greedy criminals fighting over the scraps of a life they had destroyed. But the most agonizing sound did not come from inside the interrogation room. It came from the hallway. A sharp, terrible gasp echoed through the open door, followed by a sound that I can only describe as a soul leaving a body. I turned my head slightly to look into the corridor. Yvonne had collapsed against the cinder block wall, her hands clutching her chest, as if her heart had literally stopped beating. Her designer purse lay abandoned on the dirty floor. Her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. She was staring at Jamal, the son she had worshipped, the son she had protected, the son she had just begged me to commit a felony for. She was realizing in real time that her golden boy had not just abandoned his children. I had systematically robbed her blind and left her completely destitute. Desmond stood frozen beside her, his knees physically buckling under the weight of the revelation. The proud, arrogant patriarch who had demanded my absolute loyalty just 20 minutes earlier was now a broken, bankrupt man. His chest heaved with ragged, shallow breaths as he realized that the $94,000 in fraudulent credit card debt was registered in his name. His house, his cars, his entire retirement, everything was gone. The son he had prioritized over me for 33 years had completely ruined his life. Desmond let out a choked, broken sob, his hands grasping blindly at the wall to keep himself from hitting the floor. He looked at me sitting calmly at the interrogation table, my pristine dossier full of facts and figures. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. He had chosen the parasite, and he had alienated the only person capable of saving him. District Attorney Rosalind Carter stood up from the head of the table. She smoothed the lapels of her black blazer, her face set in lines of absolute righteous fury. She looked down at Jamal and Chloe, who were still screaming at each other across the metal table. Detective Carter said, her voice slicing through their chaotic shouting like a guillotine dropping, "Arrest them both. Read them their rights. We are processing them for criminal child endangerment, aggravated identity theft, wire fraud, and elder financial abuse. And notify the federal authorities. We are taking this to a grand jury." The consequences had officially arrived, and there was absolutely no one left to pay the bill. District Attorney Rosalind Carter's command hung in the sterile air of the interrogation room for a fraction of a second before absolute chaos erupted. The lead detective did not hesitate. He signaled to the two uniformed Atlanta police officers standing just outside the heavy wooden door. They stepped inside, immediately pulling their standard-issue steel handcuffs from their utility belts. The sharp metallic clinking sound echoed off the concrete walls, a definitive and terrifying noise that finally shattered the illusion of my brother's untouchable reality. Jamal tried to stand up his chair, scraping violently against the linoleum floor, but one of the officers firmly pressed a heavy hand onto his shoulder, forcing him back down into the seat. The officer swiftly grabbed Jamal's wrists, pulling them securely behind his back. He began reciting the Miranda rights in a bored, monotonous voice that only amplified the severity of the situation. He informed Jamal that he was officially under arrest for criminal child endangerment, aggravated identity theft, wire fraud, and fabricating digital evidence. Jamal was sweating profusely. The expensive, lightweight designer shirt he had worn specifically for his luxury Cabo vacation was now clinging darkly to his back. He looked frantically toward the hallway, his eyes wide and completely stripped of their usual arrogant glaze. Next to him, Chloe completely lost whatever fragile grip on reality she had left. The second the other officer grasped her wrist to secure the steel cuffs, she let out a blood-curdling, high-pitched shriek. She thrashed wildly in her metal chair, her blonde hair flying across her face in a tangled mess. She deployed her weaponized tears with maximum force, weeping and hyperventilating, entirely convinced that performing severe emotional distress would force the authorities to handle her with kid gloves. She screamed at the top of her lungs that she was a mother, that she had severe anxiety, and that she absolutely could not be placed in a holding cell. But her performance was entirely useless. Her tears, which had served her so flawlessly in luxury department stores and family holiday gatherings, held absolutely zero currency in a precinct interrogation room filled with cold, irrefutable financial documents. She looked at District Attorney Carter, pleading for sympathy, but Rosalind did not even blink. She simply watched the officer secure Chloe's wrists behind her back with an expression of absolute, unbothered authority. Rosalind had spent her entire career prosecuting white-collar criminals who believed their zip codes exempted them from the law. Chloe was just another Tuesday afternoon case file to her. "Dad, do something!" Jamal yelled, his voice cracking with the frantic, terrified pitch of a man who had never been forced to fight a single battle on his own. "Mom, tell them I did not know about the retirement fund. Tell them to let me go. I am going to lose my investors." I was looking through the open doorway into the corridor, begging the very people he had just systematically bankrupted to jump in front of the bullet for him one last time. But Yvonne could not even form a coherent sentence. My mother was still slumped against the cinder block wall of the hallway, staring blankly at the dirty floor tiles. The reality that her entire life savings had been funneled into a Cayman Islands account by the very daughter-in-law she constantly defended had completely broken her spirit. The protective, fierce matriarch who had stormed into my penthouse to demand I sacrifice my freedom for her son was gone. She did not reach out for her golden boy. She did not scream at the officers to release him. She just wept, emitting a low, hollow, devastating sound of absolute soul-crushing defeat. Desmond, however, was a man entirely defined by his desperate need to maintain control and preserve appearances. He stood frozen in the hallway, his chest heaving as he stared at his son in handcuffs. He looked down at the financial documents spread across the interrogation table, and the brutal mathematics of his situation finally clicked into place. With $94,000 of fraudulent credit card debt registered in his name, and his wife's retirement accounts completely drained to zero, Desmond was financially paralyzed. He realized in real time that he could not hire a high-powered defense attorney to sweep this scandal under the rug. He could not even afford to post the basic cash bail required to get his son out of a county jail cell tonight. His eyes darted around the room, frantic and wild, until they locked onto me. Desmond stumbled through the open doorway, completely ignoring the police officers processing the arrests. He stepped right up to the edge of the metal table, his hands trembling violently as he gripped the steel edge to keep himself upright. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a sickening, desperate hope. The arrogant patriarch who had stood in my kitchen barely an hour ago and ordered me to commit perjury was entirely gone, replaced by a begging, broken man. "Kendra, please," Desmond pleaded, his voice stripped of all its usual booming authority. "You have the money. I saw your penthouse. I know how much you make at those massive corporate firms. Pay their bail. Pay for their defense lawyers." I sat perfectly still, my posture absolutely rigid. I smoothed an invisible crease from the trousers of my crimson suit, taking a slow, deliberate breath. I looked at Desmond, studying the beads of sweat pooling in the deep stress-induced lines on his forehead. I looked at Jamal, cuffed to a metal chair, whimpering as the reality of a federal indictment set in. I looked at Chloe, sobbing incoherently as an officer read her rights. "You cannot let your brother go to a federal penitentiary," Desmond begged, a single tear rolling down his cheek. "You cannot let the mother of your niece and nephew sit in a jail cell. They made a terrible mistake, but they are your family. We will pay you back. We will figure it out together as a family. Just write the check, Kendra. Please, I am begging you." The sheer, unadulterated audacity of his request hung in the sterile air of the precinct. The level of delusion required to ask a woman for hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees directly after discovering that the defendants had actively tried to frame her for a felony was staggering. Desmond was still operating under the twisted assumption that preserving the family name from public disgrace was more important than the fact that his son had just robbed him blind and tried to destroy my life. He still believed that deep down I was the obedient scapegoat who would eventually cave to familial guilt and open my wallet to fix the catastrophe. I looked at the man who had stood in my beautiful, hard-earned home and demanded I take a criminal child endangerment charge just so his golden child could secure startup funding. I looked at the father who had commanded me to throw away my certified public accountant license, my career, and my future, all to ensure Jamal could catch a first-class flight to a Mexican beach resort. I slowly reached forward and closed the thick cover of my leather-bound dossier. The heavy material fell shut with a solid, definitive thud that echoed through the quiet room. I rested my manicured hands flat on top of the binder, feeling the cool leather beneath my palms, and I stared directly into my father's desperate, pleading eyes. I stared directly into my father's desperate, pleading eyes and felt absolutely nothing. There was no lingering childhood guilt, no desperate need for his approval, and certainly no pity. For 33 years, Desmond had commanded every room he entered, operating with the unearned arrogance of a patriarch who believed his word was absolute law. He had spent my entire life demanding my respect while constantly diminishing my achievements. He had expected me to shrink myself so my older brother could cast a larger shadow. Now he was gripping the edge of a cold metal table in a police precinct, sweating through his shirt and begging the daughter he discarded to save him from the son he worshipped. I looked at the tears welling in his eyes, and I did not blink. I slowly slid my hands off the thick leather cover of my dossier and stood up from the interrogation table. I smoothed down the front of my crimson blazer, making sure every line of my suit was perfectly immaculate. "You want me to write a check?" I asked, my voice dropping into a deadly quiet register that forced everyone in the room to hold their breath. You want me to empty my bank accounts to hire high-powered defense attorneys for a man who spent his morning forging digital evidence to frame me for a felony. You want me to save a woman who smiled in your face while she systematically drained every single penny of your life savings into an offshore account. Desmond swallowed hard, his hands shaking violently against the steel table. Kendra, please, he choked out, his voice cracking into a pathetic whimper. They made a mistake, but they are your blood. We are your family. You cannot just walk away and let the system destroy them. I leaned forward, resting my palms on the table and bringing my face inches from his. I did not raise my voice, but every word I spoke was laced with absolute lethal precision. You stopped being my family the second you walked into my penthouse and demanded I take a criminal record for him, I whispered. You stopped being my father the second you looked me in the eye and told me my freedom was worth less than his luxury vacation. You wanted me to burn my life to the ground because you were too much of a coward to hold your golden boy accountable. Yvonne let out a loud, agonizing wail from the hallway, sliding down the cinder block wall until she was sitting on the dirty precinct floor. She buried her face in her hands, rocking back and forth as the reality of her total bankruptcy and her son's impending federal indictment crushed the last remaining fragments of her delusion. I shifted my gaze back to Desmond. You spent my entire life telling me to be a team player, I stated, echoing the exact toxic phrase they had used to manipulate me for decades. Well, you finally got what you asked for. I am a team player. But I only play for my own team now. You raised a parasite and you let him feed on you until there was absolutely nothing left. Deal with it. I picked up my heavy leather dossier and tucked it securely under my arm. Elias stood up beside me, buttoning his custom navy suit jacket with a satisfied, predatory smile. He looked at Jamal and Chloe, who were both frozen in their chairs, completely immobilized by the sheer magnitude of their incoming legal destruction. We are done here, I announced to the room. I turned my back on my father and walked straight toward the open doorway. I did not look at Jamal as he suddenly snapped out of his shock and began screaming my name. He strained against his handcuffs, begging me to come back, demanding that I not leave him in this filthy room. I did not look at Chloe, who had dissolved into a puddle of hyperventilating panic, weeping about how she could not survive in a jail cell. I simply walked out. The sound of my leather stilettos clicking sharply against the precinct linoleum echoed down the corridor, entirely drowning out my mother's continuous wails. Every step I took felt lighter than the last. I was shedding 33 years of emotional manipulation, gaslighting, and financial extortion. I was walking away from the burning wreckage of their empire, and I was not looking back. But my business in that building was not completely finished. Before I could leave the precinct and return to my peaceful, undisturbed life, I had to ensure the only two innocent people in this entire catastrophe were protected. I asked a passing officer to direct me to the temporary holding offices for Child Protective Services. Elias walked beside me, a silent, formidable bodyguard, as we navigated the maze of gray hallways. We found the social worker sitting at a small desk near the back of the building, reviewing a stack of intake forms. She looked up in surprise as I walked in, setting my dossier down on her desk. I understand that Trey and Maya are currently in emergency temporary placement, I said, maintaining a professional, collaborative tone. I also understand that standard protocol involves looking for viable kinship placements to avoid entering the children into the foster system. The social worker nodded, looking slightly relieved. Yes, ma'am, she replied. We typically look to the grandparents first, but given the circumstances surrounding the arrest and the fraud allegations, that might be complicated. It is more than complicated, I corrected her. My parents, Desmond and Yvonne, are currently entangled in a massive federal financial fraud investigation because of the suspects. They are completely bankrupt, and they are facing imminent foreclosure on their home. Furthermore, they have a documented history of enabling the suspects' severe negligence. They are absolutely legally and financially unfit to take custody of those children. The social worker furiously jotted down notes, her brow furrowing with concern. I understand, she said. And are you offering to take temporary guardianship? I shook my head. Placing them with me would guarantee a relentless, toxic campaign of harassment from my parents. They would show up at my high-rise every single day, bringing chaos and instability to those children. Trey and Maya need to be completely removed from the blast radius of this family. I opened my dossier to the final section and pulled out a clean printed profile. I slid it across the desk toward the social worker. I highly recommend you contact Bethany Warren, I stated, tapping the paper. She is Chloe's older sister. She lives in Charlotte, North Carolina. Bethany is a middle school principal with a spotless record, a stable home, and a deep, profound love for her niece and nephew. I explained that Bethany had cut Chloe off 5 years ago because she refused to tolerate Chloe's weaponized incompetence and constant financial manipulation. Bethany was strict, she was grounded, and she operated her household with absolute accountability. Most importantly, she lived 300 miles away, meaning my parents could not drop in unannounced to poison the environment. The social worker reviewed the profile, her expressions softening into a genuine smile. She thanked me profusely, noting that having a thoroughly vetted out-of-state kinship option drastically simplified her job and provided the best possible outcome for the kids. I left her with Bethany's direct contact information, completely confident that Trey and Maya were about to be placed into an environment where they would actually be parented instead of used as props. Elias and I finally walked out through the heavy double doors of the main precinct lobby. The late afternoon Atlanta sun hit my face, washing over me with a brilliant, blinding warmth. The crisp air smelled like absolute, unadulterated freedom. We stopped on the concrete steps leading down to the visitor parking lot. Elias turned to me, adjusting his briefcase. He told me that he would personally monitor the federal docket to ensure the fraud and endangerment charges stuck. He assured me that my name was completely cleared from the false police report and my professional record remained immaculate. I thanked him for his ruthlessness, shaking his hand before he turned and walked toward his luxury sedan. I stood alone on the precinct steps, watching the city traffic flow steadily past the building. The legal dust was finally beginning to settle. The towering empire of lies my family had spent decades constructing had completely collapsed into rubble in a matter of hours. My golden child brother was sitting in a holding cell, facing years of federal prison time. My sister-in-law was weeping in handcuffs, her secret offshore accounts frozen by federal prosecutors. My parents were bankrupt, broken, and entirely stripped of the unearned arrogance that had defined their existence. I walked toward my car, pulling my keys from my pocket. I had survived their relentless attempts to break me, and I had utilized my specific set of skills to completely neutralize their threat. The war was officially over, but the aftermath was just beginning. 2 months is exactly how long it takes for a grand illusion to completely shatter against the cold, hard concrete floor of the federal justice system. Fast forward 60 days from that explosive afternoon at the downtown precinct, and the landscape of my former family looks like an active war zone. Jamal and Chloe are currently sitting in separate federal holding facilities, awaiting their official sentencing hearings. The grand jury did not just indict them on a few minor charges. The prosecution threw the entire library of criminal statutes directly at their feet. Between the aggravated identity theft, the wire fraud, the bank fraud, and the criminal child endangerment, my golden child brother and his remarkably fragile wife are staring down a mandatory minimum of 7 to 10 years in a federal penitentiary. Chloe tried her absolute hardest to secure a plea deal by offering to testify against Jamal. She sat in the proffer room and unleashed a torrent of her signature weaponized tears, claiming she was merely a helpless victim of his financial manipulation. But federal prosecutors do not bargain with women who actively launder stolen retirement funds through offshore shell accounts in the Cayman Islands. Her tears finally ran completely dry. The afternoon, the federal judge denied her bail, classifying her as a severe flight risk due to her hidden offshore assets. Jamal is faring no better. The tech startup investors he was so desperate to impress dropped him the second the arrest record hit the public databases. The arrogant, entitled entrepreneur who thought he could use my pristine record as a shield is now learning how to trade commissary items in a county jail cell. My parents, Desmond and Yvonne, are experiencing an entirely different kind of prison. The bank did not care about their country club reputation or their desperate, tearful excuses. The foreclosure on their sprawling suburban home was finalized 3 weeks ago. They were forcefully evicted by the sheriff's department and are currently renting a cramped, dingy two-bedroom apartment in a less than desirable zip code just outside the city limits. I heard through the grapevine of gossiping aunts and uncles that my parents still refuse to acknowledge the absolute monster they created. Yvonne spends her days sitting in a tiny linoleum kitchen, blaming the justice system, blaming the banks, and primarily blaming me for refusing to bail them out. They still cannot fathom that their total financial ruin was orchestrated by the very son they worshipped. They lost their wealth, their home, and their carefully curated social standing, but they stubbornly hold on to their toxic pride. I let them keep it. Pride is a terrible substitute for a retirement fund, but it is the only thing they have left. While their entire world burned to the ground, my professional empire expanded in ways I never could have anticipated. Last Tuesday, my assistant notified me that I had a lunch reservation at a highly exclusive private dining club in Buckhead. The invitation did not come from a corporate client or a standard networking group. It came directly from District Attorney Rosalind Carter. When I walked into the private dining room, Rosalind was already seated, looking absolutely immaculate in a tailored ivory suit. There was no pretense and no superficial small talk. She ordered a bottle of sparkling water and looked at me with a profound expression of absolute professional reverence. She told me that in her 20 years of prosecuting white-collar crime and political corruption, she had never seen a civilian compile a forensic financial dossier as meticulously structured and legally devastating as the one I dropped on that interrogation table. She deeply respected my absolute refusal to fold under the immense emotional pressure of my toxic family. We sat there for 2 solid hours, discussing corporate fraud asset recovery and the highly specific challenges of navigating the Atlanta legal and financial sectors as driven, unapologetic Black women. Rosalind did not view me as a broken victim of a tragic family dispute. She viewed me as a highly lethal, highly intelligent asset. By the time the waiter arrived with the check, we had forged a formidable professional alliance. She introduced me to a tight-knit network of elite prosecutors, judges, and financial regulators who constantly require independent forensic auditing for complex state investigations. Jamal dropping his children on her porch was meant to completely destroy my peace, but it inadvertently connected me with one of the most powerful legal minds in the state of Georgia. I walked out of that lunch with a lucrative new state consulting contract and a fierce new ally in my corner. The family that tried to tear me down and lock me in a cage of obligation only succeeded in elevating me to a completely untouchable tier of the city. The only aspect of this entire ugly ordeal that ever truly mattered to my heart was the safety and well-being of my niece and nephew. Trey and Maya are currently thriving in Charlotte, North Carolina. Bethany, who is Chloe's estranged older sister, was granted full permanent custody by the family court judge. Bethany is a strict, no-nonsense educator who runs her household with the exact kind of structured, loving accountability those children desperately needed. I receive weekly email updates and photos from Bethany showing the kids smiling, playing in local soccer leagues, and finally living a normal, healthy childhood, completely insulated from the chaotic, narcissistic whirlwind of their biological parents. I set up a secure, anonymous educational trust fund for both of them, ensuring their college tuition will be fully covered when the time comes. I protect them from the sidelines, acting as a silent guardian, rather than a visible target for my parents' desperate manipulations. They will grow up knowing they are loved and supported, but they will never have to carry the heavy toxic burden of the family name. I am currently standing in the center of my penthouse living room. The evening sun is slowly melting into the Atlanta skyline, painting the sleek glass skyscrapers in brilliant shades of burnt orange and deep violet. My phone, sitting on the pristine quartz kitchen island, is blissfully and entirely silent. There are no frantic text messages demanding emergency loans to cover luxury car payments. There are no voiceless calls from a mother attempting to gaslight me into submission or a father demanding my absolute obedience. There is only the quiet, serene hum of absolute freedom. I walk over to the custom wine fridge and pour myself a generous glass of a very expensive vintage Cabernet. I walk back toward the floor-to-ceiling window and look out over the sprawling city that I conquered completely on my own terms. I excised the malignant tumors from my life with surgical, unfeeling precision. I protected my peace, my career, and my immense wealth from the people who felt completely entitled to drain me dry. I built an impenetrable fortress where only those who bring respect, honesty, and genuine loyalty are granted access. I take a slow, savoring sip of the dark, heavy wine, letting the rich flavor settle on my tongue. A quiet, victorious smile spreads across my face as the vibrant city lights begin to flicker on, one by one, against the darkening evening sky. The battle is over, the empire is secure, and the screen fades to black. This story serves as a powerful reminder that boundaries are not just suggestions. They are the absolute foundation of your peace and survival. For years, Jada endured financial exploitation and emotional manipulation from a family that prized an entitled golden child over her hard work and well-being. By quietly securing her finances, maintaining meticulous records, and ultimately relocating in secret, she built an impenetrable fortress around her life. When the ultimate betrayal occurred, she did not allow guilt to force her into taking the blame for her brother's reckless criminal choices. We often feel obligated to clean up the messes of our toxic family members under the guise of loyalty, but true loyalty should never require you to sacrifice your freedom, your career, or your self-respect. The lesson here is clear: you cannot save people from the consequences of their own actions, especially when they actively try to destroy you in the process. Stand firm in your truth, protect your assets, and never let anyone use your success as their personal safety net. If this story resonated with you, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your own experiences with setting boundaries in the comments below.